Okay, it is 5:30, so we're going to get started because we have a packed hour. Hello and welcome to the second installment of the Changemaker series presented by the Center for Ethics and Social Responsibility. This is a virtual speaker series highlighting changemakers who are using business as a force for good. Tonight, we've invited Demesha Hill, a leader in the Colorado impact business community, to join us for a conversation on diversity, equity, and inclusion. I'm Sarah Neuner, and I'm so excited to have you all here, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from Demesha and our incredible moderator shortly. But first, we at CESR would like to recognize that CU Boulder, and our work there is located on the traditional territories of the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute peoples. In addition, 48 contemporary tribal nations are historically tied to the lands that make up the state of Colorado. Second, at this point, it seems like everyone has zoomed down, but as a reminder, please keep yourself on mute. And I recommend the speaker view for this event over the gallery view, and that function is located on the upper right corner of your screen. To submit a question during the event, please submit it to me, not our moderator, Justine. You can do that by selecting my name in the chat area. Also, this session is going to be recorded, so students can watch it at their convenience later on if they choose to. Okay, I'm going to hand it over to Justine Roberts, who will be moderating this event. At CESR, Justine works with students and the business community to design experiences that build networks and capacity, and with faculty to promote thought leadership in the social impact sector. Justine's career has been in purpose-driven environments, specifically education, nonprofit management, and strategy. She has designed and launched commercial products for educational technology companies and has served as an executive director twice, once guiding a turnaround process for a children's museum and once running a statewide arts education program serving under-resourced communities across Colorado. Okay, without further ado, take it away, Justine.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I am really excited to be here today, and it's really a pleasure to be in the role of moderator. I do have questions prepared, but I very much want this to be an opportunity for students to ask their questions. So audience, if you have a question, do not hesitate to raise your hand. This is such an important and critical topic. Okay, so I get to introduce Demesha, which is a lot of fun. Demesha serves currently as Managing Director of the Janus Henderson Foundation. And if that's not enough, she's also Community Relations Manager for Janus Henderson Investors. She is a champion for community engagement programs, and she provides leadership and strategic support for corporate diversity and community outreach initiatives. Demesha also has served or serves on several nonprofit boards, including CIVIC, Cleo Parker Robinson Dance Studio, and the Advisory Council for Colorado Succeeds. In 2018, Demesha was named Corporate Executive of the Year by the Colorado Black Chamber of Commerce. And we are just so thrilled, Demesha, to have you here with us today. I want to get started by talking a little bit about the work you do now. And then I think we'll probably back up and talk about how you got to where you are. But just to give us some context, I am under the impression that Janus Henderson has 11 employee resource groups, maybe more now. And if you could talk a little bit about what the ERGs do, the ones that are focused on diversity and inclusion, what they do, and a little bit about what Janus Henderson does generally in its diversity and inclusion efforts.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Justine. So when it comes to our overarching strategy, we have a couple of different layers. So we have our overarching D&I committee, which represents executive committee members, senior leaders within our organization. Then we have regional councils, which really talk about the issues that are occurring in each geographical region in which we operate in. So we have one for North America, one for EMEA, and one for the Asian Pacific region. And then we have the employee resource groups, which is really the grassroots organizations of employees really coming together to help kind of move the needle on what we want to do from a diversity, equity, and inclusion standpoint. that committee actually sets our overarching strategy when it comes to how we attract talent, how we recruit talent, how we retain talent, and then the ways in which we engage in the community. They also determine overall budgetary items for our employee resource groups. The regional council really focuses in on regional specific kind of challenges and opportunities. So for example, this year, racial unrest was a big topic within the North America region. And so it was really important for us to address that here in the US, but also talk to the other regional councils and say, is this also something that you're dealing with? EMEA, absolutely. They had some of the same protests and things going on in that region. Asia Pacific was kind of on the outside, and they were kind of in the midst of COVID, and they were seeing things in the news, but there was not as much activity happening. So they kind of help us customize our approach in each different region. And then the employee resource groups really kind of play a role being kind of the ears on the ground. They have been the champions of a lot of changes, such as policy changes, benefits that we should be considering to make our organization more inclusive, as well as new recruiting partners that we should be working with to ensure that we're casting a wide net when it comes to the talent that we're trying to recruit within our organization.
Great. So it's a very interesting structure. I'm curious if this is a structure that you think is fairly typical.
Yeah, I think that there is usually some sort of governing body which happens within an organization. I think the thing that makes our structure a little bit unique is that, yes, my function sits within HR, but the chair of our committee is actually our chief financial officer. So it's not our head of HR. And we were really intentional about that because what we wanted to make sure that everyone knew, yes, HR plays a role, but every single person within our company plays a role in helping us achieve our goals. And so I think it's a little bit unique in that factor that it's not led by HR, it's more led by our chief financial officer.
Great. So that leads me a little bit into my next question, which is about working across functions and departments and levels within the organization. I think it's fairly typical for there to be tensions within an organization, particularly around diversity initiatives and initiatives that promote inclusion. And I'm curious how those play out, not necessarily specific examples of tension within Janus Henderson, but when there are challenges around how quickly or slowly to move or whether to enact specific policies or not, how do you navigate the different schools of thought or the senior leaders and the staff? Where do you sit in that process?
I am the voice of reason. And so I do have both sides of the equation coming my way, where people say we need to be really slow and methodical in our approach. And I get that and I understand it. And then other people are questioning why we didn't do it yesterday. And so there is a common middle ground. And so what I need to do is be that voice of reason that says, okay, we can't have a knee-jerk reaction to everything that happens. What we're doing is we're doing this for the long haul. And so all of the different pieces that we put in place help tell the story of how we're truly committed to this work. And I'll give you an example. We did go out with a statement in connection with all of the racial unrest. And we've seen a lot of companies, especially in the financial services sector, saying we're going to increase X percentage of employees by X target date, or we're going to give so much money to this organization. And so I had employees actually reach out to me and ask, well, what are we doing? And I says, well, we've been doing this for a long time. If you look at our track record of how we've supported community-based organizations focused in on those underrepresented communities, we've been doing this work since like the early 2000s, right? So we don't need to do a grandiose kind of PR campaign because we're in this for the long haul. Our track record proves that we're committed to this work and we're just building upon our existing kind of commitment. So just reinforcing kind of that message with all levels within the organization, and also understanding that when it comes to this work, it's going to take time because you have to change people's mindsets and you have to change behavior. And so I always like to use the analogy of going on a diet, right? We are not going on a diet where we're going to see fast results within a month, and then we're going to regress back to our old habits within 2 months. We are looking for lifestyle changes. And so what we're trying to do is really change these mindsets that are going to ultimately drive the right behavior and actions from our employees.
So how do you measure success in this space? Do you use metrics? And have you ever had an initiative that didn't get you where you wanted to go?
Yeah, absolutely. So the way that we measure success is there's a couple of quantitative items. We look at, overall demographic representation based on gender identity. We look at race and ethnicity. We look at kind of applicants in the pipeline and slice and dice that to see, are applicants funneling through our applicant pipeline at the same rate? We also look at promotion data as well as turnover data. But then we also look at things like our employee engagement scores. Are our employees engaged across the board? Are there any segments of our employee population that is more engaged or less engaged? And then we also have specific diversity and inclusion questions on our employee engagement survey, which asks, do you feel like we as a company value diversity and inclusion? Do you feel like managers support different perspectives and outlooks within your department? And we use that to also measure, our success and really what we're doing.
And how often do you send out those surveys to employees?
So employee engagement surveys, we send those out once a year, and that's part of a larger survey. So it talks about, do you have a supportive manager? Do you take pride in the organization in which you work in? Do you have the tools and resources that you need to get your job done? Are we helping you with your career pathing and development? And so since D&I is just part of the work that we do, that's just an additional question that's actually in that survey.
Great. Going back a minute to how you actually change people's minds and behaviors. Elise was curious to ask more about that. And I'd like to add on to that because most people will not have the leadership position that you do. There's only one of you in an organization, typically, if at all. So for people who aren't in your seat within an organization, what advice do you have for them about how to be an ally and how to make a difference?
Well, I feel like the way that you can change people's behavior, and I'm not going to call this a mistake, but it's just something that people can grow upon, because I didn't touch on the mistake or opportunity question, Justine. A lot of times people feel like if I just do a training, then everything is going to be fixed. So if I do unconscious bias training, then everyone's going to be fixed and the world's problems will go away. And so that's kind of a pitfall that a lot of times people fall into. I think it's not only having kind of formalized training, if you can partner with your HR team or training team to offer that, but also sharing experiences, right? And I think that that's something that each and every person can do. Being authentic, when you are in the workplace, really helps change people's mindsets and thoughts, because someone might have this perception of, oh, this person is actually this way, and not really have an understanding that that individual might have caregiving responsibilities, not only for a young child, but also for an aging parent. So maybe that's the reason why they're being really quick with their time in meetings, and you can only meet with them at certain times. But by having that conversation, it changes those perceptions that people have about that person, and it creates a more inclusive environment. And so I feel that that's something that each and every single person can do, regardless if they're in leadership or not, is being authentic with other people, and other people will be authentic with you, and you can start to build those relationships.
And speaking of caregiving responsibilities, if you hear screaming in the background of my screen, I will mute when I am not speaking, but I apologize in advance for having working from home. So I want to talk a little bit more about the intersection of EDI work and COVID and racial justice, and the ways that it's changed things or not inside Janus Henderson and business in general. We've seen a big wave of corporate messaging, particularly in the spring. There was a lot of ad campaigns, a lot of hashtags, a lot of new language and statements and promises. What do you think is really changing? And where do we go from here to build on that initial energy and commitment?
I think that it opened up people's eyes. And I think that if everything happened, if we weren't forced to stop and kind of reflect, I don't think we would have gotten as much momentum around all of the racial injustices that are happening. I think the fact that COVID happened, we were all locked in. We are all kind of feeling this, like this sense of kind of not being able to do what we'd like to do. We had to stop and really think about things. So we weren't driving around, we weren't looking at our phones, we weren't rushing to the office. We really had a time to sit back and assess what was happening around us. So I think that with everything that happened, there is a greater awareness. And I really seen that awareness outside of the United States. Yes, the incidents with George Floyd and Breonna that happened here in the States, but to see the outcries in London and in France and the protests happening there, and them having conversations about some of the same things, I don't think it would have happened if we weren't all in this kind of lockdown situation. I think people start to realize that we are all interdependent on one another. And so if there's one group of people that are being oppressed, we're all being oppressed. And I think that in some instances, we felt that oppression by not being able to do what we normally would do as a result of COVID. And so we were like, oh my gosh, if this is happening to someone, my neighbor or my friend or my coworker or my children, I need to do something about it. And so I think we have more people active and engaged on this topic. And I think what makes this really, really unique is people were actively seeking out ways in which they could educate themselves. They were starting to realize that I don't necessarily know everything and the world is not necessarily perfect. And so I think that there was this heightened awareness that we haven't seen in the past. Yes, there was a lot of campaigns that kind of came out, but I do see that there is also some longevity with that. You know, the conversations and dialogues are continuously happening, even though we are, 4 or 5 months past kind of the initial kind of point. And people are starting to take this as a way to activate and make a change and make a difference.
Thank you. Marcy, did you want to ask your question? I see one in the chat.
Hi there, Demesha.
Hi.
Nice to meet you. Thank you for talking to us today. So I read recently that certain companies like Starbucks and possibly some others are tying their highest level, C-level compensation structures to their DE and I, not only efforts, but outcomes. And I wanted to ask if you foresee that with Janus.
Yeah, so we started tying some of our measures to gender diversity. So we actually signed a charter back in 2017. It's called the Women in Finance Charter, and we pledged to get a certain percentage of women in senior leadership roles. At the time, our goal was 25%. We've exceeded that goal this year, and now we need to reassess our target. But that was something that we had signed back in 2017. And I feel like what gets measured actually gets done, and having compensation tied to that is a motivator, and it lets everyone know that senior leaders are committed to that work. That particular charter focused in on gender. We're also looking at other areas such as race. So I think organizations need to make that decision for themselves on whether or not they should tie senior leadership compensation to that. But I don't think that it's a bad idea, because if it's truly a business priority, just like, maybe acting like an owner or being, fiscally responsible, all of those are goals that can impact your pay. If diversity, equity, and inclusion is something that is part of the company's DNA, it should also be one of those factors.
And Jess, I know you had a question for Demesha about her background.
Yeah, actually, thank you for bringing attention to that. I am very curious about how Janus was, I guess, led to you transitioning from different, I guess you started as an EA, which I am actually an EA in a financial company. And it's really fascinating how you transitioned into like kind of gaining more and more diversity roles. And then now that's kind of like, more overarching your responsibilities. So I guess if I can kind of form that into a question.
Yeah.
Able to like work directly with them, or were you like kind of voicing what your desires were, or did they kind of come to you? How did that play out?
Absolutely. So the way that it evolved is right when the tech bubble actually happened, we realized like there was a lot of groupthink. And so it was like, how do we get some additional diversity of thought? And so they wanted to pull a committee together to help them identify different pools of talent that they could actually recruit from. And so I heard about this and I raised my hand and volunteered. And so I took an active role on helping them kind of shape that initial strategy, had focus group meetings with employees, explained to them what an employee resource group really was after participating in some conferences and events. And I did that because it was a passion that at the time my executive really supported and I was really interested in. So carved out time for me to kind of explore this as kind of a stretch project and assignment. That stretch project and assignment kind of morphed into a role, me moving from the sales organization into human resources, focusing in on diversity and employee events. And then that kind of morphed into me doing work within the health and welfare space, looking at the types of benefits that employees should have and we should include in our plan designs. And I continuously had the responsibilities of the diversity and inclusion work underneath me when I was doing health and welfare benefits. And the unique thing about that is there's so many things that you can do in your role that can influence what is going on in the diversity and inclusion strategy. So when I looked at things when I was working in health and welfare, when I was looking at plan designs, I was like, what additional benefits can we do to be more inclusive? Can we offer elder care benefits and backup care benefits? And maybe we should have floating holidays. So those that have military service don't have to take a vacation day to go and do their annual exams. And those that have other religious holidays that they'd like to observe outside of our traditional holidays don't have to go into their PTO bank. There's holiday time available to them. So in every role that I've done, I've looked at the work that I do and try to inject some of those diversity and inclusion elements. But it really all started with me being an advocate for myself and raising my hand and saying, this is something that I'm interested in. And the same thing with the foundation work, the same thing happened. That used to sit within our marketing department. And then there was some changes and they says, this shouldn't really be in marketing because, you know, it should really be for the benefit of the community. And we shouldn't necessarily have maybe a view that might be seen as a conflict of interest where it sits in marketing and it might be driven by kind of what we want to do for our clients. And so I raised my hand and I said, you know what? I have a lot of community partnerships as a result of what I've done with diversity and inclusion in health and welfare. I would be interested in kind of taking on this responsibility. And so then that kind of morphed into what I'm doing now. So I'd say be your own advocate, because a lot of times people can't read your mind on what you want to do and your desires, and they might not necessarily see all the skill sets that you bring to the table as kind of an EA. And I think that it's the best thing that I could have ever done was being an EA, because I have the ability to communicate with senior leaderships, appeal to what is of interest to them, be short and sweet because I know they have a limited amount of time, but also the ability to build those relationships at that senior level.
Demesha, I've looked at your educational resume. I know you have degrees in business administration and organizational management, as well as some other certificates. But I'm curious if there's anything from your personal experience growing up that you feel you bring into the work you do now, because you were just talking about sort of what we call the soft skills, right? About building relationships and communication and working across different types of departments. That seems to be a big piece of how you're successful in your job. And I'm curious where you think that comes from.
I think that just really comes from my upbringing. You know, I have had to always adapt to new changes and new environments. Moving from Texas to Colorado at a younger age, I had to adjust to what Colorado was like compared to what Texas was like. Also, being raised by my grandmother, I had an opportunity to see some of the challenges that she had raising me. And then when I started to design benefits, I kind of thought about that. I put myself in other people's shoes because I've seen those examples as a result of my own family life. And then I think also just the way I was educated. I grew up in, those who are familiar with Colorado, I'm not sure if everyone's Colorado residents that are out here, but I grew up in Montbello, and Montbello in the late 80s, early 90s was predominantly Black. They had a high gang population, but then my grandmother worked for a company that where she was a caregiver, and one of the caregivers said, you know what, your granddaughter is really smart. She should apply to this school called Kent Denver. And she's like, what? She's like, I think she should really apply to this school. And so imagine me coming from Montbello, going to Green Valley Ranch and going to Kent Denver, which is a prestigious college preparatory school. It was like night and day. And so by having that experience at a young age, it allowed me to be able to interact with all types of different people, just kind of being submerged in those various environments. So that's why I think experiences really help people grow and help define and change behaviors.
Thank you for sharing that. There's another question about creating leadership buy-in. I think people are very interested. Oh, there's Marissa. I'm going to let you ask. Marissa, go ahead.
Hi, sorry, I was not ready to be on camera, but I was asked. Yeah, so my question was, is there a way, do you know ways to create leadership buy-in, or have you had experiences where you've met resistance from leadership? I know that being in different parts of the hierarchy in academia where I work, it's sometimes you can find a lot of buy-in in some places, but you can't find them. It's harder to find them in other places. And especially the way that we work in a bureaucracy can be very difficult. And I've heard people talk about top-down versus bottom-up approaches. And and all of that. So I was just wondering what sort of your take on that was.
I think you have to use top down, bottom up, and side to side approaches. Okay. So, so, you know, when employees or those that are the individual contributors are saying and demanding something, you know, leadership has to listen to that. And so, you know, I build business cases. I ask survey questions. I pull together focus groups to really help build my case. But then I also leverage those allies that are already saying, yes, 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 we need to do it. Besides me presenting that, I have them leverage their influence to help influence those naysayers into why it's the right strategy for us. And to be honest, I've gotten no's. I've gotten no's before. And I take that as, you told me no today, but that doesn't mean that you're going to tell me no a month from now. So if I'm really passionate and I have that conviction of this is the right way for us to go about this, I'll continue to ask the question and ask them, why are you resistant? Get a little bit more information of why they don't necessarily want to go or agree with that proposal, because they might come back with a, I don't like this element of it, and maybe if we redesigned it this way, I could buy into it. You have to be open to that too, and not be so steadfast on this is the way and the only way. Be open to suggestions and ways in which you can find kind of a middle ground.
What do you think the biggest opportunity is right now for Janus Henderson in DEI work? Where do you think the next big project is?
I think the big project for Janus Henderson, and it's not just Janus Henderson, it's just the financial services industry as a whole. I do feel like there is a lot of brand, I'm going to say misconceptions about financial services. And so I think that we need to do a big PR push, just like the tech companies made technology cool. We need to make financial services cool, right? Because there's a career and opportunities for everyone. So I think as an industry, we need to elevate the industry and elevate the work that we're doing there and make sure that people understand that regardless of your background, your, you know, gender identity, race and ethnic identity, there is a place and there's jobs and careers in our industry for you. So I think we need to do a better job of communicating that and promoting the industry as a whole. And so you've started to see a lot of financial services specific organizations coming up, like the Diversity Project and NICSA and the events in the Investment Association, that's really focusing in on the industry as a whole, because that's an opportunity for us all.
So I know you mentioned earlier, Janus Henderson is an international company. You have people in very different parts of the world, which don't share the same history as the United States when it comes to race. And diversity maybe more generally. So I'm curious if you talk a little bit about how you think about policies. Do you make different policies for different parts of the world? How do you take account of data tracking for different populations? You know, what's different between here and say London or India or Southeast Asia?
Yeah, absolutely. So what's important from a race and ethnicity standpoint is definitely is different. So one of the things, we have gotten so accustomed to disclosing information here in the United States, it's commonplace for us to have information about our race, gender. In the UK, this is very, very new. The only thing that they really tracked was gender. So we're working very diligently to get the proper consent in place so that people feel comfortable disclosing that information and they know that we're only going to use it for specific purposes. So outside of the United States, race isn't something that's really tracked on employees' records. So we have to get that proper consent to track that information. Other things from a policy standpoint, we have standardized equal opportunity and diversity and inclusion policies. We have standardized anti-discrimination and anti-harassment policies across all of our regions. And so we go over and beyond the extent of the law to protect our employees within the four walls of Janus Henderson. But for example, there are no legal protections for those that identify as LGBTQ in Singapore, even though we have policies that state you will not be discriminated against based on your gender identity or sexual orientation. Outside of those four walls of Janus Henderson, we don't know what's going to happen. So we have to take that into account and be very sensitive to the way in which we promote and do things in certain regions.
I think that's really interesting. I hadn't really thought about what the commonalities could be and where the differences were. And just a follow up on that, when you're reporting out for the kind of an American audience, which cares about certain kinds of diversity, do you only report out on the American workforce, or are you looking globally at the data when you're talking about those kind of results?
Yeah, so the way that we report it, we report gender globally. When we're looking at race and ethnicity, up until recently, we only had that information for our US population. So we would put an asterisk and say this is a reflection of our US employee population only. So we would kind of put commentary around the statistics that we were reporting out, as well as making sure people understood it's not because we don't want to be transparent and share. It's just we have to be respectful of people's privacy, and there's certain privacy laws that restrict us from just automatically kind of just collecting it or making it mandatory that they fill that information out.
Yeah, and do you have to make the case in other countries about why these diversity initiatives matter? Is it a totally different starting point on the conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. To be honest, as we were starting to collect that demographic information outside of the US, just a few months ago, and we're still in the process of collecting it, we had to have a business case as to why we want that information, because there's some cultural sensitivities. For example, with like in Japan, and how, maybe some other nationalities are in Japan and they might not necessarily want to be recognized. And so we have to be really sensitive to that information and modify the categories so people feel comfortable answering the questions. So for example, when we look at ethnicity here in the United States, we look at, do you identify as Hispanic or not Hispanic Latino? Okay, that does not translate outside. But then when I'm looking at race in the United Kingdom under the category of Caucasian and white, I have all these other Irish, Scottish that we need to account for. And then when I go to APAC, I have to be very, very high level. Do you identify as Asian, African, Black, Caribbean, one or more, or two or more races? And so we have to kind of modify the way that we are pulling that information together, in the way that we're actually asking those questions to be culturally sensitive. And we don't even ask questions about LGBTQ identity like we are starting to ask in the US as well as in the UK.
Thank you. I think that's really interesting perspective, the kind of global workforce and the differences in different communities. I want to come back to the US for a minute and talk a little bit more about where we are as a society right now. I'm curious if you think that we're going to be having the same kind of conversation about how far we need to move and how much more work there is to do in 20 years. And if not, what's going to change to allow us to be in a place that is more inclusive? And keep in mind, a lot of the people here are students, and so they are our future change makers. What is it that they need to do in their careers so that we don't end up here again?
I think that every time, people are like, oh, we're fighting the same issue. Didn't we talk about this in the 90s? And didn't we talk about these same challenges and issues in the 1960s? And yes and no, right? So there's been so many different things that have changed and evolved. And so I think it's important for us to understand where we've come from to understand where we're going. So I think the best thing for you to take a moment and look at how much progress we've been able to make. We no longer see white only signs or colored people signs anymore. LGBT inclusion is just kind of a way of life. We didn't see that 25 years ago. There's a lot of progress that has been made. We talk about trans identities and gender identities. And at one point in time, there was only, two identities. And now there's so many different gender identities. So I just take a minute to digest how far we've come. And so I think that the students on this call need to understand that it took individual people. It wasn't like big fancy leaders in corporate offices. It was individuals coming together as a collective to make all of this change actually happen. They were part of the movement. They were the ones that were demanding that things change. I tell you, when I started my career, never in a million years would I have thought that I would be working from home or even have an option of working from home. And this is prior to COVID actually happening. But it was because of that generation that came behind me that demanded, I want a work-life balance. I seen my parents work themselves to the bone and they weren't there for me. And I don't want that. And so they forced corporate America to make those changes. And so understand that you have power to make changes and just take a moment to reflect on how far we've come. Look back at, what were the headlines 60 years ago or 70 years ago, or even 100 years ago. Every time I look at the Today Show and they talk about people who are celebrating the 100-year milestone, you're like, oh, these people were born in 1920. Think about how far we've come since 1920, and these individuals have seen all of that change. And even though you might feel like, oh my gosh, we're not doing enough quick enough, we're doing a lot. So don't get frustrated. You're doing this for the long haul. So just know that you have the power to make the difference.
I love your optimism. I think it's fantastic. I'm really curious about the culture at Janus Henderson. I think a lot of people are looking for, in an impact job, they're looking for a workplace that already buys in to the kind of environment that they want to be part of. And did you find that Janus Henderson from the beginning was this kind of inclusive place, or do you feel like, and you've just made it better, you've built on what was already there, or how would you characterize kind of the culture and how it's changed over time?
I do feel like it was an inclusive place, and we've gotten better and we've built over time. But I think what has really helped drive it is the influx of just diverse ideas and diverse thoughts that has really helped shape that culture and environment. And I think one of the unique things about it was we've always been a really small, I'm going to say a smaller firm. If you look at our footprint, we're not a 10,000 employee organization. Our footprint is about 2,200 employees around the globe, and we have large pockets in the US and large pockets in the UK. So there's still this kind of smaller feel where there's this entrepreneurial spirit where if you have a good idea, it's welcomed. And that's always been the case. But I think what we have seen is just really the evolution of having more women in the workplace, more individuals that identify from different ethnic and racial backgrounds. And so I think that diversity has changed over time. I've seen it change since I started working there, and it continues to change and evolve. So I'm going to say it's always been inclusive, but it hasn't always necessarily been diverse. And that's one of the key things. You got to have the diversity and the inclusion in order to see kind of those results.
Okay. When you are hiring or conducting an interview, when you're on a hiring committee, what kinds of things are you looking for? Yeah. Well, what skills, what qualities?
I'm looking for growth mindset. So someone who has the ability to learn and grow. Sometimes people will get stuck in, well, I'm looking for someone who meets all of these skill sets and checks all of these boxes. And I look at what skills do I truly, truly need? There's some things, being personable. Sometimes you just can't train someone to be personable. And if they're going to be working with me, they have to be personable, right? I can teach you how to do a pivot table in Excel. I can teach you how to do a PowerPoint presentation, but I might not be able to teach you how to be personable. So I look at some of those softer skills and those skills that they bring to the table and that they can use immediately. And then some of those harder skills, I can kind of teach them that, because it's going to change over time. And so we're going to always constantly be learning and changing and adapting. And someone who has that desire to learn. So someone who's willing to grow and think outside the box, and who doesn't get kind of stuck in ruts. Those are some of the skills that I tend to look for. And someone who's resilient. Because being in financial services, you have good days and you have bad days. One day the market's great, and the next day the market is in the toilet. And so you have to be resilient, and be really optimistic and know that, okay, it's going to come back. If what goes down is going to go back up. And so you have to have kind of that resilient attitude as well.
Okay, and building on that, I'm curious on behalf of students, what is it that they can be doing now while they're in school to best position themselves for jobs like yours? Obviously, again, we recognize that your job is very hard to get, but what should they be doing?
Yeah. One of the unique things that you can do, and it's easy and you don't always think about that, is how do you gain new skills by volunteering? So is there things that you can do, organizations that you can volunteer with? So maybe you're going to school to be an accountant, right? Well, maybe there's a nonprofit organization that's looking for a bookkeeper, and you're like, well, I can volunteer a couple hours a week to help you with your books, teach me what you need me to do. That's a unique way for you to gain a skill and put it on your resume. And then you can say that you have experience doing that, right? And so it's a win-win for the nonprofit organization, as well as it's a win-win for you, because it gives you a chance to demonstrate those skills. And you won't get turned away because you haven't had any experience doing that. You can say, yes, I've had experience, and I did it with a volunteer organization, and I volunteered my time doing that. So it's a unique way for you to get some skills.
Okay. And on the same path, students do a lot of informational interviews, and we encourage them to introduce themselves to people that they're curious about or whose jobs maybe one day they hope to have. What are some good questions for them to be asking? If somebody wanted to follow up with you, what would you hope that they would want to talk about?
I would think that I would expect them to kind of ask a little bit about kind of my educational background and my work experience. I think that's always key, because I think so many times people think I go to school to get this certain job, and then once I graduate, I get that job. A lot of times people's careers are not lateral like that. They zig, they zag, they move, they change. And so I think it's important to get that insight when you're doing those kind of informational interviews with people.
Great. What questions would you be likely to ask a student?
I would ask them, what are they passionate about? So that's going to be my first question, is what are you passionate about? And so what type of job can you do that's going to fulfill your passion? Because then you're not working. So I think that that's really key. And even if it feels your passion, but then there's some parts of the job you don't like, you're going to be really engaged because it's filling your bucket and doing those things that you're really passionate about. And then you'll just put up with the things that you're not necessarily excited about. You'll get them done and do it, but you know that it's fulfilling your ultimate passion. And then I'd also ask them, like, what's your goals? Where do you want it? Where do you see yourself? Right? what's your ultimate like goal and mission in life? And I know that that's really lofty to think about as a student, but you know, if your ultimate goal is to, you know, I don't know, own a nightclub, right? Then set yourself up with things that's going to help you get to that spot of owning a nightclub, for example. Those are the things that you should be spending your time on, and that's going to make you actually happy. You're in what you're trying to do. Other things I would also say is, you know, travel. Try to get to know, I mean, if you have an opportunity to do an exchange program as a student, sign up for it and do it. There's nothing like being submerged in another country's culture to understand what it's like to live outside of the United States. And that's going to make you so much more marketable in whatever career that you're going to go into, because you have a heightened cultural intelligence.
Thank you. Yeah, we have time for one or two more questions. So if there are any students that have been waiting to ask one, or anybody in the audience, I know that's not all of you are students, please do not hesitate to raise your hands. We do want you to ask the questions that you want to ask, although I could talk to Demesha all day. I find it so fascinating. I'm curious if you have mentors in the work you do now.
Absolutely. I do. I have mentors, and I've always had mentors. And I don't want you to think of mentors as this is a formal matchmaking process and I need to go to a mentoring organization and they match me up with someone. Mentors are very important, and mentors don't always look like you. I have had, especially me being in my career, I had mentors that were white men that supported me and boosted me in my career. I also had sponsors. And I'm going to say, when I was an EA, my boss was a sponsor. So he was the one that carved out that time for me so that other people could see the skill sets that he saw in me. And so he pushed me in that direction. So it's one thing to have a mentor to get career advice and talk about a work problem, but it's also another important element is to figure out who's going to be that sponsor. So who's that person that's cheering for you in the room when you're not even in the room, and who's recommending you because they see something in you that they want others to see as well.
Demesha, I have a question for you, and I hope it's not a silly question, but you spoke earlier about authenticity being important in changing hearts and minds and shifting culture. And I'm a part of a group, a cross-functional group at my job, and I'm trying to shift the culture and put more importance on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I'm struggling a little bit. And I'm wondering if you have advice on how to practice authenticity.
Yeah, so I think one of the things to do with the working group is maybe do a team building session around authenticity. Mike Robbins has his book, Bring Your Whole Self to Work, or Be Yourself Because Everyone Else is Taken, which talks about authenticity. So that could be a good book read for the working group. And then I always like to start like a conversation with, we do this authenticity session at our organization where we have different people talk about themselves. And we ask this one question, and the question is, if you knew me, you would know what? And so if people really knew me, they would know what about me. And so that starts the conversation, and maybe have everyone go around and share a little bit about themselves after they've kind of read the authenticity process, and ask them questions about, you know, what about yourself is a persona that other people have actually put on you versus who you truly are? Because there's a lot of things that we do just based on personas that others have given to us. I'm the youngest child, so I need to act this way because this is the way that my parents expected me to act being the youngest child. Is that truly who you are, or are you just living in or playing into that persona? And sometimes in the workplace, we play into personas based on the titles in which we have. So, and our position within the organization. So don't let that position and that title dictate how you show up and how you can drive change.
that's so great. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Okay, well, we are just about out of time. Demesha, it was such a pleasure hearing from you. Thank you so much for sharing your insights, your wisdom, your advice, and yourself with us this evening. Really appreciate it. I'm going to hand it back over to Sarah now.
Yeah,
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. I have a few quick housekeeping items. The first is that CESR has many exciting upcoming events focused on sustainable and socially responsible business. If you want to hear more from Demesha, she will be moderating a panel on sustainability and finance later this week. You can find more information about these events on our website. CESR has launched a new program for students called CESR Explores, where students can receive prizes like memberships to Naturally Boulder, books on sustainable business, or even a virtual lunch with the CEO, all for attending CESR or CESR affiliated events. And this event counts. So that's one or one more for your tally. And lastly, we are on the eve of the election. Coloradans are already smashing our voter turnout records. Make sure you're a part of this historic moment. Colorado does offer same-day voter registration. If you've already voted, check in with your friends and family and encourage them to vote. You can visit vote.org for more information and additional resources. Everything I just mentioned, upcoming events, CESR Explores, and voting is going to be sent to you from me, along with a feedback survey. So please take a moment to fill that out so we can continue to improve our programming. Okay. That's it. Thank you so much again to Demesha and to Justine, and we hope to see you all online soon. Bye.
Have a wonderful evening, everyone.